Well, welcome to another edition of Intentional Conversations. Intentional Conversations, we seek to interview leaders in men's ministries, helping men to grow spiritually and leaders and pastors to reach the men in their churches today, uh, discussing today's culture and the issues men face day to day. The program where a men's leader or a man's leader interviews leaders in men's ministry. I am Mike Sandlin of Cape Fear Men. It's good to have you with us as you listen in to this broadcast. Those of us who have been in men's ministry for any length that knows the scripture that states, as iron sharpens iron, so does one man sharpen another. That comes from Proverbs 27:17, and a lot of men's ministry organizations uses that. But there's another scripture I consider important in understanding how one man helps another, and that comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, which states, two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Well, today, this program, I think we're going to be discussing the importance of men having other men in their lives, and why do I need to have men in my life? And so if you are listening to us live, feel free to submit questions or comments, and we will be happy to address as many as we can. So let me welcome to the broadcast studio with me my good friend Rich Gorecki with the organization Good Buddies to the program. So Rich, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mike. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you all today.
Good. Before we really get started in our discussion, our conversation today, let me share our audience a little bit about you, who you are, where you come from. And now Rick is a self-professed regular kind of guy, writing his first ever book based on his personal experiences with authentic friendships that will be out in the near future. And so I look forward to that book. But Rich lives in the western suburbs of Chicago and is married to his high school sweetheart, Cindy. Together, they have raised three adult boys into young men and have a dog and attend the local Presbyterian church there. He is a volunteer leader of his church's men's group. He's a former assistant scoutmaster with the local Boy Scout troop, a previous youth T-ball and soccer coach, and an occasional mentor with the Wayside Cross Ministries, an organization that helps men in transition, and an active member of the Dads of Great Students programs, dogs, I believe they call it, at the nearby elementary school. In his free time, he enjoys golf, biking, running, and watching just about any kind of sport activity, especially his beloved White Sox, Bears, and Bulls. We won't hold that against him. Okay. He's a graduate of Lewis University at Romeoville, Illinois, and works in printing and publishing industry while planning for the next chapter of his life here on earth. Good grief, guys. Sounds like you got a lot of things going on.
Well, one thing, that's I like to stay busy, so a lot of things going on, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's really is great to have you with us. And I appreciate, like I said, taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us, to share your heart and your ministry and this ministry that you call God Buddies. I really think it's an interesting concept. But before we dive into that, I want you to share a couple of things with us. Number one is, what is your favorite verse, or what is your life verse, so to speak, and why is that verse so meaningful to you?
Well, it's interesting that you opened with the discussion about Proverbs 27:17, because that is my life verse, and it's actually become the foundation for everything that I talk about when it comes to God Buddies. And, to really understand how that helps make men better, it's good to kind of understand. I always tend to steer the conversation to understand a little bit about what's called metallurgy, which is the science and engineering of the chemical behavior of metallic elements. And so if I can give you just a little bit of historical context around that, it'll help you understand why it's such a foundational verse for me. So back in the biblical times, the primary metal in the Middle East was bronze, because the ancient technologies didn't have the advancement enough to generate the temperature high enough for melting. And working with harder metals like the iron ore that was more prevalent at that time. And those of you who work with metal know that bronze is composed of copper and tin, so it's relatively soft and doesn't hold an edge very well. Well, as the Bronze Age was ending, there was a dramatic upheaval in the world at that time, whether it's invasions and wars and collapses of whole cultures. And the Israelites at the time had migrated to Canaan, and the chaos had disrupted all of the trade routes leading into that region. So there was a real scarcity of bronze. There was plenty of iron ore around at the time, but the Philistines had monopolized the area and the technology. So, they dominated Israel for many years at that time. But over the next few decades, the Israelites developed the skill of iron making and began to make these iron weapons about the time of King David. So by the time of David's son Solomon's writing, of the book of Proverbs, which this verse comes from, the making and the sharpening of iron swords was a lot more commonplace. Where it really gets interesting is when you understand how this metal was made and the swords were made. It's all about the chemical reaction of, or what's called smelting, of how they take the iron ore and turn it into the metal that was used to make swords. So the process of smelting actually eliminates the impurities or the weaker, less valuable parts of the ore that was mined, and that's what they used to create what's called the bloom, or the mass of iron that they would turn into the swords. So this bloom that was hammered when it was still hot becomes a sword, and there's a process behind that. And that process of shaping parallels what we as men can do when we spend more time together. So this white hot mess of iron bloom gets hammered and pounded on until it breaks off the weaker impurities, and then it gets honed with a more pure piece of iron, and it becomes a pure piece of metal itself. So in other words, the transformation of this rusty, crusty old rock has its impurities removed, and then there's a lot of heat and some hammering that makes it into the sword that it becomes. The last step of all of this is that when the bloom needs to have an edge raised to make it sharp, it's still dull. So it gets hammered and sharpened until it's becomes a weapon. So we've all heard the saying that a man has lost his edge, and therein lies the parallel to where God buddy friendships, as I call them, come from this passage, because there's an incredible sharpening and refining that occurs when men spend time together, refining each other. The hammering and the heat of our difficult conversations between friends who have come to trust each other helps them eliminate the pure impurities in our souls, and then help us become better, more refined men. So that's why that's all become a really my life verse and the foundation for what God Buddies has become.
Well, that's interesting. It's just iron sharpens iron, one man sharpens over, that verse in Proverbs 27:17. I mean, you hear it all the time, especially when you begin to talk to churches and men's leaders and ask them what is their mission, what do they base their ministry off of. Just about every one of them will use that verse. But at the same time, I think. And I appreciate you sharing that. I think the other one of Ecclesiastes 4:9-10, where it talks about two men working together, that's so important in our lives. And I think we forget that in so many ways. But before we get deep into that discussion of God buddies, let me ask you this. Could you quickly share your testimony, how you came to Christ, and what drove you into the ministry you're in now?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to do that. So as you alluded to in the introduction, I'm from the southwest side of Chicago, so hence my White Sox and Bears affiliation. But like many of the immigrant families of the time, we settled into neighborhoods here where it was primarily Polish Catholic or Southside Irish and Italian Catholic. So we grew up going to a Catholic church. My family moved out to the suburbs when I was about 2. We went to a local Catholic church, and I attended CCD classes, as they're called, and was confirmed, and actually began taking classes to be an altar boy. But like many people, I became the quote unquote Creaster, a Christmas and Easter attending person, until I met my wife, who was a Presbyterian. We were married in her church, and as I like to tell her, those were two of the best decisions I ever made in my life, to become a Presbyterian and to marry her. So that's the beginnings of it. But my faith journey really changed several years later after we had kids. And I had started a career working for the leader in the industry I was working in. We had growing family of 3 young kids. We ended up having twins. And I was beginning to feel the pressure of a new career in sales and that responsibility that comes with a growing family. And honestly, I was struggling with balancing that role, had a work-life imbalance, and was given more responsibility along the way, was asked to manage the largest account in a region, and I was working on Saturdays and sometimes on Sundays to meet conference calls and presentations to management and all that. But with 3 young kids and a wife who was working at full time, the pressure was really on me. And needless to say, we're extremely busy family. But I was mentally exhausted after work, and I brought that stress home. And by the end of the day, I just couldn't shut my mind down, and it led to a lack of sleep and excessive stress, and sleep deprivation made me irritable to my wife and grouchy and unable to concentrate. And I was overeating, and I drank too much, and the pace and the stress of life was just not where I wanted to be at that point. So I went and saw my doctor, who was concerned about how this was affecting my health, and he started talking about the possibility of depression and all that. And I just wasn't feeling it, and he prescribed some short-term medications that got my sleep patterns back in order. And, that helped some of the symptoms, but it didn't fix the root cause of all of this, which was my wrong priorities. I put too much pressure on, my work life and not enough on my family life.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, my wife pushed me to get involved in the church's men's group, because she said, you need to get something else on your mind. And I look back on it and think that she must have known that there were some other guys in the group that, maybe struggled with this themselves, and maybe a little bit of Bible study would change my thought patterns. And deep down, she just knew that was what I should have been doing. And, we all have those same kind of struggles. And, I later discovered that there was an awful lot of guys in there who struggled with the same thing.
Yeah.
So that kind of got me started on this path toward really a little bit of self-reflection and reordering my priorities. So as I got involved in the men's group, I realized that there was so many other guys who talked about work-life balance and all these other issues. And at the time, I was an early 30-something, and I saw the gray hairs in there with so much more wisdom. I'm like, man, I got so much to learn from these people. And, our senior pastor at the time at the church openly shared his own struggles with work-life balance. And he was a great help for me at that time. He was about 10 years older and had teenage children, so he shared wisdom with me about getting through those really difficult teen years. But I also began to forge some relationships with other guys in the group, and heard about all of their struggles with alcohol and drug abuse and lust and pornography, marital problems, anger, pride, name them all. They were all there. And, we had new guys join the group, and the issues were all the same. It kept coming up, and nobody was talking about it.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it is. And as we began to talk about it, we just got to the point of saying, why is it that we don't have friends that we can talk to about this kind of stuff anymore? Because we don't trust the acquaintances that we have, where there's the feeling of competition, daily competition at work, and the busyness of life, and all those things that just get in the way from men having friendships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's interesting. You talk about the struggles. You talk about the struggles and life issues, work-life balance, and all of that. And for some reason, some of us men, we don't realize that we're not the only ones going through that. We just about every man I have ever met, if he ever begins to feel comfortable to talk to me, shares the same struggles. Maybe a little different here and there, but basically it's the same thing in every one of us. So you talked about there's your God buddy friendship. What's the difference between just a good friendship and a God buddy friendship?
Yeah, it's a great point that I like to make to people because, we all have those close friendships that we grew up with, and we try to hang on to them, and maybe they're people we went to school with or served in the military with or something like that, and we think that those are long lasting friendships. But, what I've come to realize is that friendships come and go. They are there for a season, and very few of them last for the various stages that we have in life. And the one thing that I've come to realize that, at each of these various stages of life, whether it's our childhood or our college or military time or a young adult, is that, we make friends via commonality, right? You usually have something that you find in common with somebody. Maybe it's a shared interest in a sports team or a hobby, or maybe your kids are in the same school play, and you start to spend a little more time with them, and oftentimes it's centered around the family. But the one thing that we have in common doesn't really get to the root of what we're trying to accomplish. And I remember reading an article once that said, the potential for a friendship is identified through finding two commonalities. They actually used a formula, and they said the first commonality plus the second commonality equals a potential friendship. So having two things in common is more than the casual acquaintance that you're sitting next to on the soccer field to that other dad who's there with his kid, and you get to know each other a little bit, but you never really get beyond talking about sports and weather and the outcome of the kid's game. But when you have a second area of commonality, like maybe you find you go to the same church, or you have the same hobby, or you work in the same industry, something begins to click between you and this other guy, and you start talking about these common interests. And maybe you even begin to call each other out of the blue. You get together more frequently because you've got a couple things in common. But these are really still at the acquaintance level, and they're certainly great to start a friendship, but they're not really the deeper friendships that most men need today. So I suggest that there's actually a third commonality needed to bring a friendship to what I call a God buddy level, and that third commonality adds relational depth in terms of friendship, even those good friendships, into something that's a God buddy level. And it's the common pursuit of living to God's standards. So my version of that earlier formula I mentioned is you have the first commonality plus the second commonality plus this third commonality of living according to God's standard equals a God buddy relationship. So it's that third level that adds the depth and accountability and all the other things that are needed to really get to something that's more than the acquaintances that most of us have today.
Well, that's pretty interesting, because I know a lot of us have what we would consider good friends, and that we do hang out and go to ball games with, do various cookouts or hunt or things of that nature. But very few of us have those individuals where you can just really dive deep into your life issues and life struggles, and be able to encourage and shape each other's life with that. How difficult, or how easy is it to create that God buddy friendship?
Well, it's not easy, but the first thing you need to go into it is realize it just takes some time, because you begin to find that commonality and stuff like that. But there's multiple traits that I would suggest are needed for that, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's not like you sit in your men's group and you say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, all the threes go over here, and you form your God buddy friendship. It just doesn't happen that way. There's something magical that happens, and the guy who was my I'll tell a little story that validates this. The guy who was my original God buddy, his name is Bill Johnson, was part of our men's group, and we had been invited along with our spouses to attend a dinner group that was within our church. And we were sitting around that first evening and just getting to know each other and talking among a bunch of friends. And Bill was really struggling with a couple things within his family and his career at the time. And this was the time when I was still, fighting my own work-life imbalance. And I pulled him aside, in between dessert and the main meal, and pulled him aside and said, hey, Bill, you want to get together for a cup of coffee? it just felt right. There was just something there. He was a guy I knew peripherally. I admired him. He had gone through some career adjustments and things like that. And we just chatted for a brief time in another room there, and then we ended up getting together for coffee. Well, fast forward a couple of weeks later, we're both playing in a golf outing, coincidentally, and we each hit a shot on different fairways. And I'm not going to say which one ended up in the wrong fairway, but as we both approached our balls, we recognized each other. We didn't realize that we were there. And as we got within 30 or 40 yards of each other, we just started pretending that we're like, oh, what are you doing? Why are you in my fairway? And just really giving each other the business. And the guys in the other groups were like, holy cow, are we going to have to bust these guys up? Are they going to get into it? Because we were just needling each other. Well, what that did is it showed that instant connection. And I think that, the Holy Spirit was at work in that, and that's where we had some commonality from the dinner group. We had some commonality. We went to the same church. We both love baseball. He's a Cubs fan. I'm a White Sox fan. So we had a little bit of discussion that goes on around that. But there was just something that clicked. And I really think the Holy Spirit comes into these type of relationships. And you just know when there's that extra level of commonality that happens between two guys.
Yeah, it's when you sit back and you talk about these God buddies, and I think about reflecting on my own life about do I have God buddies in my life, and when did I do? One of those days I couldn't help but reflect back to my college days when I first got out of high school and I went off to college. I connected with this guy who I actually went to high school with, but he was a year ahead of me in school. But and we became like best buddies, and you see one, you see the other. We did things together. So, and I can reflect back on him as being a God buddy, my first God buddy that I may have had, because we could share things with each other and never be concerned with the other one judging or condemning or any of that kind. But instead, know that whatever I shared with them, they would just listen, or they would encourage, or he would pray, whatever the case may be. And we shared that with each other. Now, our lives went in different paths, and he's ended up pastoring a church in South Carolina, and we finally reconnected, so to speak, mainly because of social media, but we did. And then now I've got guys that I meet with every week. I got several guys that I meet with every week. And they're kind of like my God buddies now, that I can do the same thing, have that same relationship. And I think some guys may have those God buddies, but they don't realize they got them. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's really awesome that you had somebody that you had that spiritual connection with early on, because I think most guys don't have that. That we go through life and, Bob Buford wrote a great book called Halftime that talks about moving from success to significance. So when we're in this early stages of adulthood, we're building successes. We graduate or finish our military term. We get married, we maybe move to another city, we start advancing our career, and we just become so busy, and we just don't have those friendships. We don't make the time for them. And that's just normal friendships, much less those with any kind of spiritual connection, Yeah,
so I think a lot of guys, they have friends that they pile around with, like we were talking about earlier. They go to ball games, they go hunting, they go fishing, things of that nature. But their subject matter stays on that target right there, whatever they may be doing, and they don't really get into any deep life issues and seeking encouragement, even talking spiritual stuff, even talking about the Bible. And that's one of the things men need in their lives today, is those other guys. Even in discipleship, we talk a lot about discipling. A lot of times in men discipling others, it's still very superficial type discussions. They don't really dive into it. So this is unique about talking about this particular area. How do you meet? Do you meet men face to face, or do you do it virtually these days, or how do you typically minister to men these days, or do you do both? I can say that I do both these days. So, what about you? How do you start developing?
The pandemic certainly has changed some things. We've continued our Saturday morning men's group via Zoom, like many of them have. And coincidentally, some of the people that have moved on to a different church or moved to different parts of the country have continued to stay with us because they've just felt that camaraderie. In fact, last Saturday, we had people in 4 different time zones join us. Now, we have a pretty small group of guys that, I belong to a small Presbyterian church. So we typically have 10 to 15 guys who sit in on our call on Saturdays. But, to have 4 former members of that group who would take the time, one of them got up at 5:30 in the morning from Portland to dial in. And some of them even come back for our annual spring men's retreat. We go up to the North Woods of Wisconsin for a weekend of fishing and golfing and just hanging out together. And some of them come back into town for that. So it just shows the power of that connectivity that we've maintained. And it's developed over the years through trust. And that's where I think men really need those people closer to them that they can trust. I mean, when you think about even the Jesus model for the 12 disciples, he had an inner circle of 3 that he kept much closer to him than even the rest of the other 9. So I think as we think about concentric circles of our friendships, every man needs to have kind of that inner circle that they can really be vulnerable with and open up their hearts and their soul to, and trust that what they tell them about, whether it's a struggle with lust or alcohol or drugs or whatever, that they can trust them, that it's not going to go outside that group. And that doesn't always happen. I mean, I've had some relationships where you tell something to somebody and it gets violated, and you just know that that's a person you got to be real careful with. And that would be one of those outer circles of closer friends that I have, not the innermost circle that I know I can really be vulnerable with those guys, because I know that it won't go outside that group.
Yeah, that's so important. I know when I've started men's groups, and we're going to do some deep studies about life issues and so forth. That's one of the first rules of the group is what is said here. It's kind of like a Vegas saying, what happens in Vegas stays and happens. Well, that's what I tell them. I said, what is said here stays here.
Right.
It's not discussed outside of this group anywhere, even amongst ourselves, because we want to keep that. We want to keep that confidence. We want to keep that integrity and level of that relationship with each other.
Yeah. Can I come back to something to that point, Mike?
Sure.
We talked about how it takes some time to develop this level of trust and all that with a relationship. I remember we ran a study retreat in the fall on a book called Every Man's Battle, which many of you may know of. It's about every man's battle with sexual temptation and so on. And, we ran a getaway retreat, and there was, 10 of us who went away for that. And there was a guy who was, not normal part of the group, but, he shows up and, man, he just opened up the floodgates and started talking about all of it. And it made a lot of people uncomfortable because we hadn't developed a relationship with him yet. Right. So he put some people off at first, where they're like, it kind of held people back for a while until we really got into the weekend some more, because it was like Friday night and all of a sudden, the floodgates were open. And that's, I think it just demonstrates how you need to develop a relationship and a level of trust that takes time. You can't just, do that in the first couple times you meet somebody. You got to give it the time to develop.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. I mean, even with the group, I have a group now that I've been meeting with for over 2 years. And it took time for those guys to really get to a point where they felt comfortable in sharing with the other groups and knowing that it's definitely something that you have to build upon. Let's talk about COVID-19 and how the pandemic has shaped our world in ministry now, in ministry men. What are you seeing in men's lives right now as far as their difficulties and why they really need to have a God buddy in their life right now? Because so many guys are out of work, they're home alone. Let's say, kind of like the movie, guys, when we're alone, we get ourselves in trouble sometimes. It seems like, and what do you are you seeing an increase in men seeking a God buddy out? We'll just use that phrase since that's what we're talking about. Are you seeing an increase of guys seeking a God buddy in their lives to encourage and mentor them?
Yeah, well, we've all seen the reports from the CDC and other places that report that there's been an increase in anxiety and depression across all age groups during this pandemic. It's an issue for a lot of people. I still think that there's people who think they can handle, guys who think that they can handle this on their own, and they just are struggling. I have one friend in particular, within my own circle of friends, that was struggling big time with anxiety and was having suicidal thoughts during the summer about returning to work during the pandemic. And he had fears that he might infect others. And it was becoming a really big issue for him. But he reached out to me and another guy, and we talked about it. And it gave, just like we would go for a walk, masked up and that in the local forest reserve. And he'd walk on one side of the path, I'd walk on the other. And we just chatted about it. And I think just that time together made him feel more comfortable with it. And, he's ultimately figured out what was causing that. It was some medication problems and things like that. But I think that demonstrates how, until you've developed a level of trust with somebody that you can really start to open up, most guys think they still handle it on their own. And that's why the Bible tells us man's not made to be alone. We're connected human beings, and we need to have somebody that we can trust and be accountable to, because, if we're left to our own devices, we're going to spiral down pretty bad. And I think particularly this past year, I've seen my God buddies come together to support each other with extra phone calls and continuing to meet, on Saturday mornings and staying afterwards to just check in with each other, and even making the extra effort to serve each other, to get together and say, hey, how can I help you? That's a really interesting question when you ask somebody, how are you doing? And he says, oh, I'm doing fine. How you doing? And then you peel it back and you go, no, really, how are you doing? You just said, oh, I'm okay, or I'm fine. Are you really fine? And it opens up a little more vulnerability, an opportunity to be more vulnerable when you ask that next level of question. And if somebody's got the relationship with you that, they're comfortable sharing that with, that it begins to start those deeper conversations.
Yeah, it's typical. That is a common answer men will give. How's your day going? It's great. How you doing? I'm fine. And he could be dealing with some of the toughest things that he's ever gone through in his life, and he just doesn't know how to ask for help in that area. So
yeah, we actually did a thing in our men's group. Occasionally, I'll run a thing called a guy talk. And I titled this one called "How You Doing?" And if you remember the clip of, I think it's Joey from the show Friends, he has one of his favorite sayings, and I showed that clip at the beginning, and then we started to talk about this a little bit more, and just saying, when you pass, it's kind of become a cliche greeting. How you doing? Okay, how you doing? But when you do ask that next level question, when somebody just says, "Oh, I'm fine," or "I'm okay," really, are you just okay? Is there something else going on? It really just helps the conversation go to another level. And that's what guys need, is the opportunity to trust somebody with those conversations.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. Well, I know your webpage is out there, godbuddies.com. And I've gone out there, of course, and looked at it several times myself. But it's primarily what I saw, and you can speak to this a little bit, of course, is blogs, writing things of what God's given you, and thoughts and opinions and processes. Can you speak a little bit about what men could see on your blog and what they can look for in the coming days?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to promote it a little bit. If you go to the blog, it's god-buddies.com. You'll have an opportunity to subscribe, and it'll get you an email pushed to you each Tuesday after I've posted something. But what what it really started as was an opportunity for me to refine my thoughts around this. In our men's group, we many years ago, we just started talking about these friendships, and I had the guys in our group just saying, "Man, you need to write a book about this." And it's become really a foundation for what we do at our church. But everybody kept talking about it, and I work in the printing and the publishing industry, or I did. I retired earlier this year, and one of the shifts that I've seen in publishing is that a lot of authors have started writing blogs, and then which has led to a book or maybe more speaking opportunities. So I'm like, everybody keeps telling me this. Why not? I'll give it a go. So I started writing in January of 2019, and spent that first year really kind of learning the technology, creating my website, and really refining my thoughts. And I had written, weekly email to the guys at our church with, random guy thoughts and what we were going to be studying this week and stuff like that. So that, they knew about it, but it really helped me understand how to put things, to refine my thoughts, I guess is the best way to put it, and put it into posts. So I started writing over, the whole year, every week about this. And then last year, obviously it became a little bit different because of COVID. But I wrote about, how we help each other. And then as I reflect back each year, at the end of the year, I write a kind of a reflection piece, and kind of summarizes the whole year. And as I reflected on this year's, it was really about how our God buddies supported each other during really tough times. And, COVID aside, we all run into tough times, whether it's a job loss or, a health issue or loss of a parent, just name them. There's all of them out there. And there's always somebody in your circle that has gone through a situation. And if you have a relationship with them, you can come back to it. So, it just helped me kind of refine my thoughts a little bit. And then as I've had other people continue to press on me to talk about turning this into a book, I spent the last several months putting it into a manuscript that'll hopefully self-publish this year, or turn into an actual hard copy book. So it's been a fun way for me to, just hone in on this concept of God buddies and what it really means. So.
Well, I know I've heard you talk about in the conversations we've had about the traits of a God buddy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you've got something like 11 different traits or something like that. We probably don't have time to go through all 11 of those right now. But what are some of the key God buddy traits that men can look for in each other that we can tap into?
Yeah, good. Yeah, thanks for asking that. We talked about the one already, which is commonality, and that's finding commonality with another man. The next one we've touched on a little bit is developing trust, and that's the second one. Once you've developed some trust, you can get to the third trait, which is confidentiality, and that's usually when that first person says, "Hey, can we get together for coffee? I got to share something with you." And you start talking about a big decision you make or a struggle and stuff like that. And that really leads to the next one, which is about our vulnerability and authenticity and just being transparent. So that fourth one, vulnerability, authenticity, and transparency, only occurs once a man becomes open and honest with somebody about their own struggles. And I've seen it personally in some small groups, is once somebody does that, the others usually follow behind. But you need somebody who's going to take that first step.
Break that barrier, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. They're going to open up that door and say, "Look, this is something I'm struggling with." And there's a great quote by C.S. Lewis that says, friendship begins when somebody realizes, "Wow, you too," and ... fill in the blank about whatever. And that's usually what happens. For me and my original God buddy Bill, he was in some career transition and was having some difficulties within his family, and we just had that commonality. But once I heard him talk about it, it's like, wow, there's a guy that I admired that struggles with the same thing. And we all try and put on this false front and pretend like we've got it all together, but nobody does. We all have issues and we all have stuff. And once somebody becomes a little more transparent, that usually opens things up. So that's the fourth one. The fifth trait is really, once you've started to get together more frequently, you need to practice good listening and show empathy to that person. We're not here to judge anybody. We just have to be a good listener. We have to wait for the period, as I call it, that denotes when somebody's finished with their point, because in all honesty, we don't want somebody to tell us how to fix something. It's a guy thing. We tend to try and fix each other. We just need somebody to listen to us. So you just got to listen. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. So that point, practicing good listening and showing empathy is really critical to just demonstrating that you care for that person. And then that leads to acceptance and non-judgmental forgiveness and unconditional love. Those are just the key to all what we should be doing as a Christian anyway, much less within your male relationships. It's not up to us to judge what somebody's got an issue about, whether it's sexual or addictive behaviors or whatever. We all have issues, so it's not up to me to judge. That's ultimately God's role, but I'm supposed to show unconditional love, and that's what I'm called to practice. But then there's times when, you need confrontation, confession, and accountability, which is the next one. And that one is where the real sharpening happens. I once had a guy pull me aside. Wasn't even part of our men's group. He pulls me aside and says, "Hey, Rich, can I talk to you for a minute?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure. What's up?" He says, "I've got this friend who's teetering on an affair." I'm like, "Really? You got a friend?" He says, "No, really. It's not me. It's my friend." And it was a college buddy who was teetering on the edge of a thing. He says, "I just don't know what to say to him." And I said, "Well, don't accept that behavior. If you want him to become a better man, you need to confront him about it, but be gentle about it and tell him that you're there for him." So, you're going to add a little bit of gentle confrontation, but you also need to hold him accountable and say, really, you're married. This isn't something you shouldn't be doing. So that's confrontation, confession, and accountability is one of the other traits. And then there's loyalty and dependability. Somebody has to learn how to trust you. We need to show patience and kindness. Those just come with being a good friend. But then when we start really getting into being a God buddy is when we're there to pray, support, and encourage somebody. I love the model of Timothy, Paul, and Barnabas. Barnabas, the great encourager, was there to be a cheerleader for Paul when he was beginning his ministry and all that. And we all need encouragement. We get beat up every day. So when you start having that third common element that I mentioned earlier about, pursuit of God, godly living, that comes with prayer and support and encouragement. And that's the essence of your ongoing relationship. But then that third commonality that I mentioned, is the desire to study and learn to become a better man. That's what we're all called to do. They say if you're not growing, you're dying. And I think part of being a disciple of Christ is that continual refinement and growing to be more Christ-like. And we all need help doing that. So, having a guy or a group of guys that you can do it with is a key to that growth. And doing life together, trying to become more Christ-like can be a lot of fun when you're doing it with other people instead of just trying to do it on your own.
Oh, absolutely, and I agree. And it's writing these traits down as you went going through them, and I couldn't help but think of a couple of them here. There's probably some of the probably hardest ones for men to do, and that's the fact of being vulnerable. For us to be vulnerable and to be authentic and transparent in our own lives, because like we talked about earlier, so many men who are going through struggles or certain issues, whether it be, well, it could be any number of things. They think they're the only ones that are going through that, and they're afraid to mention it because guys will look down on them if they even mention a concern in that area. And the other thing is something my wife gets on me about a lot of time is you're not listening, guy. You're not listening. Sometimes those guys, we have a hard time listening and just being quiet, just letting somebody else talk to us and allowing them to have full undivided attention. But these are great things. These are good traits for us all to listen to and look into and look for in men. I think it's interesting, and I wish more men would understand the importance of having a man in their life.
Yeah, I still haven't, there's really, I love the quote from, there was an 18th century English social commentator and philosopher by the name of William Hazlitt that said, and he said, there are no rules for friendship. It must be left to itself. We can't force it any more than we can force love. So there's really no set of rules where you can just hand the guy a book. Here I am talking about, a book that I'm going to write about this, but it's not something that, you can follow this prescribed set of rules and here's how I'm going to go about doing this. I think you've got to pray about it a lot. You've got to reach out to somebody and take the risk. That's probably one of the biggest things for most guys is we're afraid to take the risk. And it's not just the risk of being vulnerable to somebody, but it's even taking that first step, that first step to reach out to somebody and say, hey, Joe, I really admire, your career and how you've done this, or, the way you're fathering your children, can we get together? I've got some questions for you. And the typical response when you reach out to somebody is, hey, you want to get together for a cup of coffee? They always go, oh, okay, well, what's up? And is he going to try and sell me, something, some insurance or whatever? We all go into it hesitant because of, I think, just the way the culture conditions us to have our relationships. But once we start the path down to a friendship of, following some of these traits, and again, there's no prescribed set of rules or path for it because everyone's different. I think you both grow tremendously. I mean, I look back on my last 20 years, and there's no way I'd have thought I've been the godly man that I am. And I want to preface this by saying I still don't have it figured out. I got a long way to go, but it's pretty amazing how other men help you grow when you're willing to work on it together.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I know that, even though I speak of the God buddy that I had back in college, and I've had some other people in my life over the years that has spoken into my life, never did I really fully understand the importance of the iron sharpens iron, so as one man sharpening another. The scripture where you need to have another man that walks alongside you, who can pick you up when you fall down, and how much trouble can be in your own life when you do fall down. You don't have somebody. I didn't even fully understand that in my own life until about 15 years ago, and when I went through a personal crisis of my own. There was a health crisis, but still it was a very, very personal crisis. So it helped me to fully understand. God used that time to get me in tune to understanding the need you have in your life. And I pray that men who are listening to this now or will listen to this in the next few days will not allow themselves to get into a point where they go through a crisis before they get another man in their life who can speak truth into their life.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier the book by Bob Buford, Halftime, and one of the premises of the book is that a man who transitions well, makes the halftime adjustments, will have a much better second half of his life. Just like a football coach, they make halftime adjustments and so on. And I think some of those adjustments are realizing that you don't have it all figured out, you don't have all the answers. And that you need some help from your quote unquote assistant coaches or personal board of directors or whatever that can help you realize your flaws and where areas that you need to improve, maybe your weaknesses. It's very critical that you give somebody permission to speak into your life that way. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't just happen. You don't just tap somebody on the shoulder one day at church unless you have a relationship with them. And it just comes with time, but it takes, you got to take a risk and do that and identify those couple people maybe that you want to get started with and initiate it. get started, reach out to somebody. That's the biggest risk, I think, is just getting started. We all are afraid of, well, what if he says no? Well, that's okay. If he says no, maybe the Holy Spirit didn't want you to have him as one of your God buddies anyway. And there's other guys out there. So go back and pray some more about it. And the right person will reveal themselves to you. There'll be a situation where that person is put in front of you at the right time for the right situation.
Yeah, you use a interesting phrase. I was here just a minute ago. Your personal board of directors. First time I ever heard that was when I read a book by Major General Bob Dees in his book Resilient Warrior. He wrote that book probably, I don't know, 10 years ago or something like that. And he uses that phrase in helping me to understand the importance of having a personal board of directors in your life so you can bounce back through whatever adversity you're going through. And you're the only other person I've ever heard say that outside of a conversation I might start.
Well, it's kind of a secular analogy too. Everybody thinks they need to have that person who's going to hold them accountable to going to the gym all the time, and maybe you have your financial advisor, or bank person, and maybe you've got a father-in-law you lean on, for raising kids or something like that. But part of that personal board of directors, I think, needs to be somebody who can help advance your faith. I mean, that's our greatest commandment is to love God and with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we need somebody that's going to help us along the way. Like many of us, we're either afraid to admit that we don't know anything or haven't figured out and don't understand the Bible. But we need somebody that can come alongside us and help us, and we've got to be okay with that.
Amen. Well, Rich, it's believe it or not, we're coming up on the top of the hour. We've been sitting here talking for about 55 minutes now, and time flies when you're having fun, so to speak. And I've enjoyed this conversation, and so it was great for you to be on the call today, and you have provided some great information. I think all of us need to digest, and I thank you for your time. So it was good to have you. If you would like to know more about Rich's ministry, go to godbuddies.com and check him out. Look at all the stuff he has here. I'm sorry that if you asked a question we did not get to it today, but you can reach out to me at capefearmen@gmail.com, or you can reach Rich at his website for more questions if you want to. In case you missed something or would like to review something that was said during this conversation, it will be available on the Cape Fear Men website within the next day. Just go to capefearmen.net/podcast and to view, and you can see this plus all the podcasts that's been done in the past. I hope you've enjoyed the program today, and if you would like to continue to help us in our work in ministering to men, please consider donating to Cape Fear Men by either going to capefearmen.net and click on the donate button at the top of the page, or text CAPE, CAPE, to 50155. Cape Fear Men is a 501c3 organization. All donations are tax deductible. And I thank you in advance for your donations to help us out. If you have other questions, just drop us an email, like I said, at capefearmen@gmail.com. Rich, again, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. You got any parting words for us today?
Well, yeah, thank you for reaching out. It's been good getting to know you over the last year or so since we first met. And I guess my parting words to everybody would be, don't try and live life by yourself. God said man should not be alone. And, we know we can't do it all by ourselves. So take that risk, reach out to somebody that you admire, that that you can trust with whatever, because we all have stuff. We all have something in our life that we tend to hide, and develop that relationship with at least one guy. Reach out to him tomorrow and start that relationship, and just trust the Holy Spirit to work in both of you, because I think in the end, you'll both become better men as a result.
Amen. Thank you again. Appreciate that words. And again, Intentional Conversations is a program where a men's ministry leader interviews leaders in men's ministry. Now, as a beloved mentor used to say to me, a blessing over me after we would finish our time together. He would say, I pray that God will give you a rock to stand on, a brook to drink from, and a tree to shade you by. Till the next time on Intentional Conversations, God bless.